Imagine standing backstage at a bustling Broadway theater during its golden era, sequins glinting in the spotlights, costumers and stage managers scurrying about, and that special electric hum pulsing through the corridors whenever a curtain is about to rise. Now picture a young performer slipping into a starched costume, heart pounding with a mix of nerves and exhilaration, mentally preparing for a role that just might make him immortal in the annals of musical theater. That performer is Daniel Joseph Lockin, a talent whose name might not immediately ring out in modern pop culture, yet who once danced and joked his way into hearts across America with an undeniable spark. Before the tragic turns and heartbreak that would eventually overshadow his legacy, he was just a small-town boy from Nebraska with a big dream. And for a while, he rode a rocket straight to theatrical success. Our journey tonight takes us from his early childhood performances at local fairs, through the glittering footlights of Hello Dolly, and into the shocking crime scene that would end his life far too soon. Born on July 13, 1943 in Hawaii, Daniel "Danny" Lockin actually spent the bulk of his childhood in Omaha, a city known for hearty Midwestern sensibilities and old-school American values. There, amid the farmland vibes and simpler rhythms of life, a star was already trying to emerge. When Danny was 8 years old, he wasn't just a typical kid riding bikes or collecting baseball cards. He was dancing at county fairs, honing a showbiz act with his friend Neil Reynolds. It's almost a classic Americana scene. Two kids from different racial backgrounds, one white, one black, tap dancing in unison, telling jokes and doing pantomimes of famous personalities. Think of it as a pint-sized vaudeville routine. The hush of the crowd, the applause, the sense that the entire world lit up whenever these two kids bounced onto the stage. Those were the seeds of confidence that would push Danny to keep striving for more. He had that intangible showman's spark, a comedic timing beyond his years, an incredible sense of rhythm, and the determination to push himself to the next level. Even as a child, Danny craved the thrill of performing. In those early days, the scope was small, just local fairs, small gatherings, and community events. But each time he tapped on that plywood stage, each time he made someone laugh with a well-timed joke, he seemed to reaffirm for himself and for everyone watching that he was destined for something bigger. Sometimes the path to stardom is about ignoring the naysayers who say you're just a kid and forging onward, one shuffleball change at a time. Then came a shift that would change his life forever. During Danny's junior year in high school, his family left Omaha for Anaheim, California. It's a familiar tale. Showbiz hopeful relocates to Southern California, aiming to be closer to the heart of the entertainment industry. Anaheim might be famous for Disneyland, but for a young performer, it's just a stone's throw from Hollywood, a realm of infinite possibilities. He graduated from Rancho Alamitos High School, diving headlong into local stage productions. You might find him prancing across the boards in Gypsy, a musical fable, or singing in The Music Man, or perhaps stepping into any role that offered him a chance to shine. He had that unstoppable drive, and local theater directors quickly noticed his unwavering dedication. As soon as he graduated, Danny turned professional. One reason he could do that was simple. He already had a glittering skill set. He could sing, dance, and even act well enough to stand out in a crowd of hopefuls. When big touring shows came to regional theaters and needed someone who could learn a routine in a flash, maintain a bright, engaging presence, and project big across the footlights, they'd look at Danny Lockin. At first, the credits might have seemed small or unremarkable. Background dancer in a local production of Time for Everything, or maybe a cameo in a West Coast show that never quite made headlines. But with each foot he placed on each stage, he was building the network that would lead him to more significant opportunities. One of those early opportunities was uncredited, but deeply formative, playing one of Dainty June's farm boys in the 1962 film Adaptation of Gypsy. Yes, it was a minor role, blink and you'd miss him, but it was the major leagues of cinema, a taste of Hollywood with capital H. Stepping onto a film set, even in a small role, is a milestone for any aspiring performer. Imagine the swirl of cameras, the frantic calls from assistant directors, the presence of real-deal film stars. For a starry-eyed newcomer from Nebraska, that environment must have felt like stepping through the gates of a dream. The exposure pushed him onward, fueling a desire to prove that he was no one-trick pony. By October 1963, he was appearing in the play Morning Sun alongside Patricia Newey and Bert Convey. Although that production closed after just 9 performances, the critics who managed to see it recognized something special in him. The New York Times singled him out for acrobatic suppleness and engaging freshness. That's the type of feedback any young dancer craves. Official acknowledgement that they bring more than just technical skill. They bring a certain charm that can't be taught. His next big leap happened in April 1964 when he made his Broadway debut in West Side Story, stepping into the role of G-Tar. Sure, he only held the part for a few weeks, but let's not undervalue the significance of landing on Broadway. Countless dancers and singers fight their whole lives for a shot at the bright lights of the Great White Way. For Danny to have already scored a role in a revered classic was a powerful statement about his potential. And it wasn't just about being there. It was about leaving an imprint on the cast and crew, showing them that he was quick on his feet, flexible in style, and ready for anything. Later that year, he starred in Tom Sawyer at the St. Louis Municipal Opera. You can practically imagine the smile on his face, portraying Mark Twain's mischievous protagonist in a musical setting, whisking audiences back to an era of small-town America not unlike his own upbringing. With each new role, he refined his dance technique, expanded his vocal range, and mastered comedic beats that left audiences giggling. He was quickly shifting from the wide-eyed hopeful to the seasoned performer, harnessing every chance to refine that intangible star quality that soared beyond just a skill set. Then, in 1965, fate dropped an extraordinary opportunity in his lap, the role of Barnaby Tucker in Hello Dolly. This comedic and sweet-natured supporting character would soon become the role with which he was almost inseparably identified. First, he joined the traveling productions across the United States, performing alongside an array of high-profile actresses, portraying Dolly Levi, Betty Grable, Ginger Rogers, Eve Arden, Dorothy Lamour, and the lesser-known but extremely talented Ann Russell. This was more than just a gig. It was the beginning of an odyssey that would define Danny's professional life for the next few years. He must have had a front-row seat to see how each Dolly used her star power to shape the show. From Betty Grable's warmth to Ginger Rogers' iconic sophistication, each leading lady carried her own comedic style, vocal approach, and stage presence. The audiences adored it. And Danny, in the role of Barnaby, anchored the comedic subplot with a mix of wide-eyed curiosity and playful physicality, perfect for a supporting character whose misadventures propel much of the show's fun. Over time, he became so adept at Barnaby's lines, dances, and comedic sequences that he could execute them in his sleep. However, not all Dolly experiences were rosy. He occasionally expressed reservations. Take Carol Channing, for instance, arguably the Dolly that many fans considered definitive. Danny once told friends that being around her felt oddly disconcerting. Those enormous, unwavering eyes bored into him while he was dancing. and he sensed that behind her famous baby-like stare was someone who, as he put it, was about 200 years old in showbiz terms. Carol was a legend, after all, and that kind of comedic genius can be intimidating, especially for a young actor still trying to find his own comedic style. He later voiced complaints about working with Ethel Merman, a Broadway icon who joined Hello Dolly in its later years. The problem, he said, was that Merman's presence dominated the entire production. The show was no longer the story of Dolly Levi, matchmaker extraordinaire. It was essentially a one-woman extravaganza. Audiences, of course, ate it up. Merman was a beloved star, and folks wanted to see Ethel Merman do her thing. But for the rest of the cast, especially Danny in his comedic supporting role, it felt like they'd become background extras in someone else's spectacle. The shift from the communal dynamic of Dolly to the star-driven vehicle of Merman was jarring. He confessed it wasn't Hello Dolly anymore. It was her show, lamenting that the sense of ensemble had vanished under the glare of Merman's iconic belt. As the Dolly mania progressed, a big break in film was on the horizon. Hollywood had decided to adapt Hello Dolly for the big screen to be directed by none other than the legendary Gene Kelly. Think about that for a second. A young dancer who'd grown up idolizing the classic MGM musicals now stood on the brink of working with one of the greatest dancers in cinematic history. The audition process, however, wasn't a simple phone call offering him the part. He went through 13 screen tests, each presumably more demanding than the last, to prove he could carry Barnaby's energy to the silver screen. The producers put him through the ringer, testing him for comedic timing, vocal ability, and, above all, dancing skill. Eventually, they decided that yes, this was Barnaby Tucker in celluloid form. When filming began, Danny was on cloud nine. He later described it as the dream of my life. But that dream came with an unspoken pressure. He was dancing under the watchful eye of Gene Kelly, a figure known for both his choreographic brilliance and uncompromising standards. On set, Danny tried to impress Kelly by demonstrating a challenging series of movements known as butterflies, sideways aerial cartwheels without hands. He performed 4 in a row, brimming with pride, only for Kelly to casually execute 6 in a row, each with more precision and flair. Imagine the emotional whiplash. You're proud, you're on a major movie set, you're proving your mettle, and then Gene Kelly humbles you in the space of a few seconds. By some accounts, Danny sulked for days afterward, yet Kelly's suggestion of improvement presumably also raised the bar for Danny's dancing. It was a humbling but once-in-a-lifetime chance to refine his craft under the tutelage of one of Hollywood's best. Hello Dolly, 1969, turned out to be a lavish production starring Barbra Streisand as Dolly Levi, with Walter Matthau as Horace Vandergelder, and of course Danny Lockin as Barnaby Tucker. The film, while not an immediate box office sensation, became a staple of classic movie musicals, and for a generation of fans, Danny's portrayal of Barnaby was as definitive as any. After the cameras stopped rolling, though, he returned to the stage version of Dolly, continuing to play Barnaby in various productions. The demands of comedic timing, dance routines, and that boyish energy day after day, night after night, eventually must have taken a toll on him. The show that had launched him into the stratosphere was also turning into a golden cage. When you're so closely tied to a single role, it's tough for industry folks to see you doing anything else. That unspoken frustration lingered beneath his bright stage persona. As Dolly mania eventually began to wane, Danny's personal life underwent big changes. In 1967, he married fellow dancer Kathy Haas, whom he'd met while performing Dolly in San Francisco. They had a son, Jeremy Daniel, in 1969, which on paper sounds like a storybook moment. Two dancers falling in love, welcoming a child, building a life in showbiz. But the reality was more complicated. By late 1969, the marriage had collapsed, culminating in divorce. Perhaps the demands of touring, the swirl of auditioning for side projects, or the general restlessness that can accompany showbiz stardom took a toll on the relationship. Whatever the exact reasons, the dissolution left Danny reeling, and that heartbreak started to seep into his professional world. He continued to tour with Hello Dolly, but the once thrilling role of Barnaby had morphed into a kind of routine. The spark was fading as he repeated the same lines and steps for the umpteenth time. The more the show demanded from him, the more he felt stuck, as if the big break from the Dolly film had ironically pigeonholed him as Barnaby Tucker in perpetuity. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that he was battling issues with substance abuse. The friendly, easygoing performer many knew was increasingly overshadowed by a more erratic, moody version of himself off stage. By the mid-1970s, his career momentum had slowed drastically. The phone calls from producers became less frequent, the star vehicles fewer and farther between. One can only imagine the frustration and sense of identity crisis that might have entailed. After devoting years to Dolly, with all its tours and the Hollywood adaptation, he found the entertainment world had moved on. He ended up back at his mother's apartment in Anaheim, regrouping, perhaps also licking his wounds. In a move many performers in transitional phases make, he started teaching dance. Together with his mother, Jean Lockin, he operated the Jean Lockin Dance Studio, passing on the knowledge he'd accumulated from a lifetime of tapping, twirling, and comedic timing. The studio was a modest success for a while, offering local kids and enthusiasts a chance to learn from someone who danced with the best. However, as 1977 approached, the studio closed down, leaving Danny to seek work in another local dance school. It's a sobering reminder that showbiz can be brutally mercurial. You can star in a beloved musical, share scenes with Barbra Streisand, impress Gene Kelly one minute, and be out of the mainstream spotlight the next. This steep drop in career trajectory sometimes hits performers hard. Danny was no exception, lost in a sea of what could have been, struggling to come to terms with a future that seemed smaller than the dreams he once nurtured. Then the story takes a dark, horrific turn. On the night of August 21st, 1977, Danny visited a gay bar in Garden Grove, California. What exactly he was seeking, company, solace, a simple night out, remains unclear. The final known fact is that he left the bar with a man named Charles Leslie Hopkins, an unemployed medical clerk with a police record who was on probation. No one that night could have guessed the vicious violence that would soon erupt. A few hours later, Hopkins telephoned police, claiming that someone had broken into his apartment and tried to rob him. When officers arrived, they were met with a ghastly scene. Danny's lifeless body lay on the apartment floor, the victim of an appalling stabbing. The details are unnerving. He had been stabbed 100 times, bled to death, and was mutilated post-mortem. It's a moment that defies comprehension. How does a charismatic dancer beloved for comedic roles end up in such a brutal, horrifying situation? Hopkins claimed ignorance, insisting he had no idea how the body got there, but police immediately arrested him. This was no random scuffle with a suspicious intruder. There was every indication that Danny had been the victim of a far more sinister encounter. The shock reverberated quickly through the local community. The suddenness, the brutality, the confusion. It all formed a wave of disbelief. People who had last seen Danny teaching dance or joking about his Dolly years could hardly fathom that he'd been killed in such a nightmarish way. The funeral took place shortly thereafter, with Danny laid to rest at Westminster Memorial Park in Westminster, California. Colleagues and friends, many from the Dolly years, must have been reeling. Here was a man who'd once leapt across the stages of America, who'd brightened film screens with a youthful grin, ending up as the victim of an unspeakably violent act. It's easy to imagine the swirl of sadness, guilt, and shock for those who'd lost touch as his life took a downward turn. But the tragedy didn't end there. The justice system had to sort out who was responsible and to what degree. During a search of Hopkins's apartment, police discovered a disturbing book filled with pornographic images depicting men being tortured during sexual orgies. Prosecutors initially intended to secure a first-degree murder conviction, arguing that Hopkins must have planned the crime. Yet legal challenges arose, particularly around whether the search that recovered the book was constitutional. A Supreme Court ruling around that time, United States v. Chadwick, 1977, established stricter limits on warrantless searches. Consequently, the judge ruled the pornographic book inadmissible as evidence, shredding the prosecution's claim of premeditation. Without that piece of evidence, the case against Hopkins grew more complicated. Then came another blow. The judge decided that the state hadn't proven intent for first-degree murder, so the death penalty was off the table. This infuriated many, given the ghastly nature of the crime. However, the prosecution had to play by the rules of evidence. Absent the pornographic book and any direct proof that Hopkins methodically planned the killing, the best they could do was to argue for a lesser charge. In September 1978, a jury convicted Hopkins of voluntary manslaughter, not murder. He received a 3-year prison term, extended to 4 years by the judge upon reviewing the circumstances. That extension was allowed because suppressed evidence, if not deemed an illegal basis to enhance punishment, can still factor into a sentencing decision. Even so, the public and Lockin's friends were outraged. A mere 3 or 4 years for a killing so vicious, so savage, felt like an almost insulting response to the tragedy. With time served in good behavior, Hopkins would likely see freedom in as little as 2 years. A faint shadow of justice for the man whose life he ended in such a terrible manner. For many who loved Danny or admired his talent, the legal outcome was devastating. The sense of injustice was sharp, not just in show business circles, but in the wider community that had any awareness of the horrific details. Some wondered if homophobia played a role in the lenient outcome. Was the system less motivated to pursue harsh penalties because the victim was gay or involved in a same-sex encounter? We'll never know precisely how those prejudices might have influenced the case, but the suspicion lingered among many who followed the trial. In the aftermath, the name Danny Lockin largely faded from public memory. Hello Dolly is often resurrected in stage revivals. The film is periodically discovered by new generations, and Barnaby Tucker remains a beloved comedic role. Yet the man who embodied that role so beautifully for so many years rarely receives the tribute he deserves for the sheer joy he provided countless theatergoers. Instead, the overshadowing final chapter of his life tends to dominate any posthumous discussion. People who do recall him often remark on how bizarre and horrifying it is that someone who danced so lightly and brought so much laughter could die in such a brutal, unspeakable way. One might rewatch Hello Dolly and see the bright-eyed Barnaby tumble across the set, full of comedic confusion and good-natured exasperation, wondering how he ended up stepping out of his comfort zone. The audiences who saw him performed in Dolly's traveling shows or on Broadway might remember the same bounding energy and comedic zest. It's worth noting that nobody is purely the sum of their best days or their worst. Danny Lockin was a complex figure, a child star who soared early, a showbiz worker who got locked into a signature role, a man who endured personal struggles post-divorce, and a teacher who tried to pass on his gifts to a new generation of dancers. In one sense, he was unbelievably fortunate. He got to do what many only dream of, dancing on film, sharing scenes with Streisand and comedic bits with legends. In another sense, fate dealt him a cruel hand, as if that once luminous star was never meant to burn long. If you leaf through old show programs or talk to older Broadway veterans, you might uncover a wellspring of anecdotes about Danny. Some might recall his unstoppable sense of humor backstage, the jokes that kept everyone loose. Others might recall a shy streak that emerged in quiet moments, or that flicker of dissatisfaction when he felt overshadowed by bigger stars. Many might talk about how he juggled fatherhood in the middle of tours, or how he always had a tip or two for younger dancers trying to refine a step. But if there's a unifying theme, it's that Danny's presence on stage was pure dynamite. He had that intangible ability to elevate a scene and draw the audience's eye, even when playing a sidekick. Revisiting his story reminds us of the precariousness of a performer's life, especially in an era before social media or more robust support networks. It also highlights the perils lurking in the complex tapestry of Los Angeles and Orange County nightlife, where lonely hearts and unresolved trauma can converge in lethal ways. By 1977, Danny might have felt a growing sense of isolation, watching the spectacle of the entertainment world move on without him. Perhaps his final nights were spent searching for connection, acceptance, or simply a sense of belonging. Instead, he found violence, and the aftershocks of that single evening would forever overshadow everything that came before. The echoes of that tragedy linger in Hollywood lore, quietly overshadowing a career that, despite its brevity, brought an irrepressible dose of fun to so many musicals. If Hello Dolly resonates with audiences even now, part of that resonance belongs to performers like Danny Lockin, who poured their hearts into embodying the comedic rhythms and bright toe-tapping sequences that define old-school musicals. Watch the film today and you might notice Barnaby's wide grin and quick step, a portrayal brimming with such earnestness you can't help but root for him. Little do most viewers realize that behind that grin was a performer dancing on borrowed time, fated to be a cautionary footnote in Tinseltown's extensive archives of tragedies. Yet it might be worth remembering him not for how he died, but for how he lived, for every pirouette, each comedic pratfall, every enthusiastic note he belted out from the stage. The best tribute we can give him is to acknowledge that from the moment he first stepped into those local fairs in Nebraska to the apex of Broadway success, he was a man defined by exuberance. He found a place on the stage with thousands of eyes fixed on him and gave them something to laugh about, something to applaud, something to momentarily raise their spirits. In a world where cynicism can be as ubiquitous as smog, that ability is no small gift. Of course, we can't ignore the dark ending because it's part of the story. It's a jarring reminder of how quickly things can spiral, and how the glitz of show business can't always shelter you from personal demons or random acts of brutality. The social fabric of the 1970s was a tricky landscape for many LGBTQ+ individuals, coming out or simply seeking companionship in an era rife with stigma. Mix in personal stress, some possible substance misuse, and the unpredictability of hooking up with strangers, and you have a situation primed for tragedy. There's no final reassurance or moral that can rewrite what happened. The heartbreak remains, an indelible stain on the memory of a performer who might have thrived had the world been kinder, or had he found support at a crucial moment? For those curious about how fleeting stardom can be, Danny Lockin's story is a textbook example. One day, you're starring in a revered Broadway musical, traveling the country in lavish productions, capturing the attention of legendary directors. Another day, you find yourself struggling to land a job, teaching in a small studio to pay the bills, and stepping into precarious nightlife scenarios in search of relief or belonging. The lesson is stark but necessary. Success can be ephemeral, and behind the stage lights, performers may wrestle with challenges few ever see. And then there's the legal dimension of the story. The frustration that many people felt when Hopkins received only a manslaughter conviction is still palpable if you read archival news reports. The concept of justice feels painfully elusive. 100 stab wounds suggest an unthinkable level of violence, yet the intricacies of evidence suppression and the legal definitions of premeditation overshadowed the raw brutality of the crime in the courtroom. The result was a short prison term that outraged those who followed the case. It's a sobering commentary on how the legal system sometimes fails to reflect the emotional reality of a heinous act. In the years since, there hasn't been a wave of posthumous tributes or dedicated scholarship about Danny Lockin. Unlike some who pass away tragically young, he never reached the peak of stardom that might have canonized him as a lost legend. Instead, his memory endures mostly among dedicated fans of Hello Dolly or among older theater enthusiasts who recall his comedic flair on stage. Perhaps that's the ultimate heartbreak, a performer whose contributions were overshadowed by a monstrous final chapter. Yet we can do our part by telling his story, acknowledging his gifts, and offering a nuanced understanding of how a promising career can dissolve into heartbreak. At the heart of it all, Danny was a dancer. That's maybe the simplest, truest label for him. He might have learned lines, delivered comedic monologues, or attempted serious acting, but his dancing was the crucial lens through which he expressed himself. It was the reason he was hired for Dolly, the reason Gene Kelly tested him so rigorously, and the reason audiences warmed to Barnaby Tucker. When you watch him move, even in old film reels or surviving stage footage, there's a vibrant sense of joy, like the music lived in his muscles. That joy transcends time. So even if the culminating violence feels like it undercuts his story, we're free to recall the lighter side of him that soared across the boards in swirling polka steps, tapping rhythms that made crowds cheer. In the end, what do we take away? The next time you watch Hello Dolly, 1969, keep an eye on Barnaby Tucker. Notice his comedic facial expressions, the bounce in his steps, the naive charm that colors his every reaction. That's Danny Lockin, a product of Midwest fairs, who scaled the lofty heights of Broadway and Hollywood. That's the kid who once performed carefree pantomimes with his friend Neil Reynolds, who overcame the huge challenge of 13 screen tests to secure the film role of a lifetime. The same man who, in the last weeks of his life, was teaching dance at a humble studio in Anaheim, perhaps longing for a second big break. He had a remarkable run, capturing moments of stage magic that few can match. And though the final act of his life was overshadowed by horror and heartbreak, somewhere in the swirl of historical footnotes lies a bright spotlight that once belonged only to Danny Lockin. Under that spotlight, in the echo of a snare drum's shuffle, he's still dancing, still smiling. If you pay attention, you might just see him there, forever young, forever mid-step, ready to coax a grin from anyone who watches.